By the mid 1750s, much of British North America still remained loosely associated. Now, I use the term British North America as opposed to English North America for a reason. Previously, when the initial colonists came to what is now present-day North America and along the East Coast, they were English. How did that transition from English to British? Well, one of the transitions became after the Glorious Revolution itself in England, where King James was ousted by actually his daughter, Mary, and her new husband, William of Orange, who basically eliminated the idea that English monarchs would never be Catholic ever again. And they established Protestantism as their religion du jour, if you will. But also they granted and signed a declaration that would allow Parliament to have more authority in the goings-on of politics. So you have more of a balance now within England itself that created a system of government known as a constitutional monarchy. You're still going to have a monarch, a king or a queen, and in this case, both. That's going to have equal power with Parliament and the creation of a prime minister. So what you see from England and the rest of Great Britain today is a constitutional monarchy. Nowadays, the royals back in Britain are almost more figurehead. Parliament and prime ministers carry more power of authority in the actual political dealings of that country. In 1707, what we know as England and Scotland officially united, creating a unification under the crown, and the newly formed country, including Wales and eventually Northern Ireland, would create the country we know today as Great Britain or the United Kingdom. So Great Britain, British, that's where that term comes from. So that now is the transition of English colonies now to British North American colonies. Okay? That's where that distinction comes from. So I want you to take note of that. And as Britain had established now its new constitutional monarchy, it was trying to flex its weight amidst other European powers who were also colonizing in the Americas. And several different things really led to a decentralization of power in British North America. Much of the executive thought of British North America, whether it was the monarchies themselves or Parliament, was really more of an afterthought. You have a number of different politicians who held very loose control of British North America. Oftentimes you would have quote-unquote regional governors who would actually stay back home in Britain and maybe even hire somebody else and appoint somebody else to actually co-see their colony. You have a very, very loose system to where merchants can operate, maintain control. You had profitable commerce within the colony. There were colonial assemblies, basically within each colony, that operated under its own semi-jurisdictions. So, these assemblies basically they had the wherewithal, rather, to impose taxes or colonial taxes unto each other because the imperial administration was so weak. So you had to have some sort of laws, some sort of governance, and oftentimes that fell on the colonial assemblies that the folks in the colonies would form. The folks back home in England, they were pretty loose. However, despite the differences between the colonists and Britain itself, the overwhelming majority of colonists still thought of themselves as British. They may not have been born in Britain, they may not live in Britain, but they thought of themselves as British subjects. And that's an important distinction because you want to be loyal to your homeland. That is your identity. You are British. You are of Britain. So, most colonists thought that way. Long story short, eventually one of our founding fathers, Benjamin Franklin, formerly had identified himself as being British. He was a British subject. Eventually, you would have an Americanization of Benjamin Franklin that would basically form the idea that through a transition, British subjects really would become their own entities. They would become Americans. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So a little bit of foreshadowing there. But otherwise, though, elsewhere in North America, and immediately to the north and the west of British North America, was French America. French North America. Predominantly French Canada, and colonies all along the Mississippi River, all the way down to New Orleans. Okay. So, as there was more of a perceived threat of French incursion, it would be important for there to be intercolonial trade, even though the colonies really referred to themselves more closely to home in Britain than to each other. They were more loyal to London than their neighboring colony, if that made sense. But because there was a potential threat of conflict in North America with the French, it would be important for the colonies to make some sort of unification agreement. It would be important for maybe the colonies to seek some sort of peace agreement with the local Iroquois nation, who may have their own thoughts about a conflict in North America among European powers. So, Benjamin Franklin, who by this point had grown from literal rags to riches in the colonies, called for an assembly known as the Albany Assembly to discuss the Albany Plan, to talk about maybe a peace treaty with the Iroquois nation that could perhaps unify some of the colonies and align their thoughts and points of view. That was a complete disaster. The Albany Plan was an assembly in Albany, New York, where you had representatives and delegates from Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, and the various New England colonies, and they were to discuss just that. Instead of unifying, what the Albany Plan actually did was just expose just how loosely affiliated and how different all the individual colonies in British North America were. They each had different ideas for commerce, pacification, anything else. They were different. And it became painfully obvious at these colonial assemblies, especially at the Albany Plan, no one approved that peace treaty with the Iroquois nation. That was a major problem. So, what do you do in that instance? There may be something down the road that could perhaps unify the colonies. But so far, in 1754, on the eve of a major conflict in North America, the Albany Plan, that's not going to be what unifies everybody.